Good morning, everybody. I'm Linda Conway. I'm the Executive Director for the New England Newspaper and Press Association. Welcome and thank you for joining us today. Today's program, Community Asset Mapping 101, is presented by NEMPA, the American Press Institute, and the New England Equity Reporting Fellowship, and it's sponsored and in partnership with the Endowment for Health. I'd like to thank the endowment for their support in helping us enhance our news coverage on race, inclusion, and identity issues in New England newsrooms. I'd like to especially thank Karen Ager, the communications director, and Melina Hill-Walker, the program director, for making this possible. A few housekeeping notes. Please make sure that you're muted and that your camera is off during the presentation. We'll have Q&A at the end, and we'll let you know when you can turn your cameras and microphones on. There'll be a couple of questions that Dr. Crittenden will ask, and if you can pop in and give your answers then. Anybody who just came on, please try to have a pen and piece of paper available. But at the end, we'll have Q&A and we'll let you know when you can turn your cameras and microphones on. And if questions come up during the presentation, you can just drop them in the chat. We're going to record the session and it will be available to you probably, if not tomorrow, then definitely by Monday. We are fortunate to have Dr. Letrell Crittenden from API guide us through this strength-based approach to identifying and building on a community's existing resources to broaden sources to include people who are experts through lived experiences. Letrell joined API in 2021 as the Director of Inclusion and Audience Growth. He specializes in issues related to diversity and inclusion in news and community-engaged journalism. He was Program Director and Assistant Professor of Communications at Thomas Jefferson University in Philadelphia, where he helped revamp the program's curriculum and served as the inaugural diversity advocate for the College of Humanities and Sciences. He's also been a fellow with the Tow Center for Digital Journalism at Columbia University and the Media and Inequality Center at the University of Pennsylvania. He earned his Ph.D. in communication from the University of Illinois. His doctoral dissertation focused on the history of the National Association of Black Journalists, of which he is a member. Prior to his academic career, he was a police and government reporter and is a veteran practitioner of community journalism. Thank you so much, Letrell, for joining us, and I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you so much for that introduction, and I'm happy to be here to speak about a tool that I think is useful, not only, especially during a cycle such as going through an election, but in general, called community asset mapping, which the idea is for you literally to map out and your communities and have a better understanding of who you're serving and who you may not be serving. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and start a presentation for you. There will be a couple of questions, but you can feel free to be off camera until I get to those questions. So let me go ahead and get to this. And we'll start the slideshow. Is everybody seeing the slideshow?
Yes.
Yep. Okay. So let me first just talk a little bit about my approach. And my approach really is that when I take a look at issues, specifically when they're talking about diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging, and also engagement, we're talking about very complex issues. So I don't believe that any single training is going to be enough, that any single approach is going to be enough. So what I do with my project, my program called the Inclusion Index, is actually take a look at either a newsroom or news ecosystems issues as they pertain to a multitude of areas. And I've been doing a lot of this work recently in Pittsburgh. So basically, I with surveying what's the diversity within newsrooms, what's the level of inclusivity within those particular newsrooms. Do people feel that they can thrive? What type of coverage do you have? Is it focusing on stereotypes, or people feeling that their full lives are being told on a regular basis? What type of engagement plans exist? What type of engagement teams exist? What's the level of trust that a community has? So I do a lot of talking and community listening within a community? What are your understanding of key community assets? And that's really what I'm going to focus on today. And then, do you have infrastructure to do this work? And what I mean is that if you're going to build out an engagement plan, or you have to actually make sure that you're building tools and making sure that the tools that you are utilizing are understood by your entire team and that they're built into the everyday workflow. So what I'm going to be sharing with you today are a few tools that I feel that not only are effective, but you will actually be able to build them into your everyday workflow. And basically, we utilize this through, it's basically a rubric. It's coming from my days as an academic and running a program, where basically we're looking at, are your efforts poor, or are your efforts geared toward having an ability to thrive in one of those areas? And very often what I see is that efforts usually are what I would call below average or token. And it's the classic treadmill that people have in their homes that's not being used. The goal is to not only have something set up, but to actually be using it and allowing for things to be done on a regular basis so that you're thriving in the work you're doing. And the way that we actually do this in terms of engagement, there's three things that I want to emphasize, actually two things I want to emphasize today. Community asset mapping, community listening, and I can certainly touch on community advisory boards moving forward. But let me just focus mainly on community asset mapping and community listening. So this is what I would like you all to do real quickly. Think back to the last two people that you spoke with from your community or coverage area. Write down their names real quickly, their titles and professions, and note exactly why you spoke with each person. Again, just real quickly, who are the last two people you spoke with related to your community or your coverage area? Write down the names, their titles, and then note the reason that you actually spoke with each person. Give you a moment to do that.
Can you put the slide back up?
Oh, sorry. Yes, 1 second. Okay, and now we're going to have math, even though doing math with a room full of journalists is not necessarily always the best thing. As somebody who fulfilled my math requirement at Penn State by taking history of math, I understand that math isn't necessarily my thing either. But the idea is, for each person, a total of 100 potential points. Give yourself 10 points if you spoke with them outside of a story for each person. So 10 for one. If you have both were outside of story, give yourself 20 total points. If it was not for breaking news or an event story, give yourself 10 points up to 20 points. If it was not a government official or head of some sort of organization, give yourself 10 up to 20 points for each. If it was for a positive story, a celebratory story, 10 points each. And if it was for a solutions-oriented story, give yourself 10 points each. So again, you can have up to 100 points based on your conversation. I know that depending on your role, you won't necessarily be able to fit, but so this will mainly be for the working journalists. Okay. So is there anybody that got to 100? You can just unmute and say, yes, I got to 100. Anybody? Is there anybody that got to 80?
I got to 80. I'm not a working journalist, but I did it in the context of my work as a program grant person.
Okay. Did any journalists get to 80?
I'm an editor, not a reporter, but I did call some sources to kind of check on some things, and I got to 80, but it was an eclipse story, so there were a lot of positive things to talk about.
Okay. All right. And anybody else get to 60 at least? The reason I do that is research will tell you the most of the time that we speak to sources will be through event stories and through breaking news stories. Something has had to happen. In fact, there was a study that was done by Tom Rosenstiel, who's now at the University of Maryland, that found that 80% of the time that reporters in Maryland spoke with sources, it was for an event story or a breaking news story. The other thing is we often will go to official top sources, heads of the CDC, politicians, people who are brand name folks when we talk with them. And that really leads to a problem with how we're actually conducting coverage. And it's what I would call the velvet rope of journalism. We want to think that we're an inclusive space where it's like some sort of festival in Philadelphia at Love Park, where everybody can go there, hang out, and you're interacting with a lot of different people. When in reality, it's much more like the place that I used to go to in my 20s, a few blocks away, where they have the velvet rope, they have the actual dress code and things of that nature. And there are certain requirements that usually have to be met for folks to get into news coverage on a everyday basis. This isn't necessarily as intentional as the velvet rope, but the fact of the matter is, it's very difficult for the average person just living their everyday lives to actually be seen by a journalist. In fact, there's research that says that less than 20% of all individuals have ever spoken with a journalist. And typically the only time that you actually see folks in news that are in everyday coverage on the left, we will go to the press conference when the new coach of the Patriots starts talking about what's happened at training camp. Even though something may not have actually happened, you're still going to be there. On the other hand, in many cases, for everyday folks, there have to be accidents, crimes. The worst days in people's lives is when we often speak with them. And that is something that in my conversations with folks across the nation, I've done research, I'm doing it in Pittsburgh now, but I've done work in New Jersey, Philadelphia, Chicago, Central Pennsylvania, all other host of places. They will tell you that they see this and they are upset by it. They know that they're not necessarily being heard. And I hear this when I have conversations with people. This is one Pittsburgh resident with the work that I'm doing, particularly Black issues are really just oftentimes covering trauma and horrible incidents. We deserve resources today. I also would like to know the media to know that they hold power. They hold the power to harm us individually. And a lot of times, as I've learned in an interview in Philadelphia, people have lost faith because they're continually seeing all of these negative stories about their communities and they're not being heard. So, is there a simple solution? No. But the approach that I take is the belief that you really need to get out and do deep research into what's happening inside of your communities, because that leads to better engagement. If you understand your communities better, you'll be able to engage them on a more, a less superficial manner. You'll be less transactional. If you're doing better engagement, that leads to better sources. If you have the better sources, a robust amount of sources, people see themselves in their everyday lives, that leads to better trust. And ultimately, you have better coverage. And one of the tools related to this is asset mapping. Now, asset mapping really is a tool that comes from sort of community organizing and also social work. So it's not something that's really utilized a lot in journalism. But what I've done is I've adapted a lot of the concepts related to community asset mapping, and I'm now using them to train journalists how to really map out and understand what we would call the key influencers and other spaces in your community where communication is naturally existing. So with that mouthful, let me just explain what it is. Actually, let's stop. Let me stop. I want you, with the piece of paper you have, draw a map of your community, where you live. If it could be something like a note card, it could be a post-it note, whatever you have. And I want you to really just draw a map. So basically get out, create streets, create pathways. If there's a park, draw the park on there. If there's a school, draw the school on there. But the idea is to note, where do people gather to hang out, chat, socialize. Again, the church, it could be a pub, it could be the bus stop. But where are people gathering to really socialize? If there's an important community organization in your neighborhood, note that. Also, is there somebody in your neighborhood that is sort of the mayor of your community that everybody knows, that's been there a long time? Note where they actually happen to live. So the idea again is create a map of where you live, note where people are gathering and socializing, and just draw everything out. I'll give you about 2 minutes to just doodle something real quick. Any questions about this? Okay.
You
Yes.
want where we live, not where we cover, right? For me, those are
Where you, thank you for that clarification. No, where you live. And the idea is, what is your everyday life outside of the newsroom or where you work? Map that out. Thank you for that question. One more minute. I usually have my cat joining me, but my cat decided to sleep on the pillow next to me. So usually you get to see my cat hanging out, but he's decided to take a nap, which is fine by me. So now we can share, and there's two reasons that I have people do this. One is and I'll talk a little bit about community listening. If you are doing any type of community listening, you really should try to have opportunities for people to do things through drawing or text. The reason is that a lot of people can express themselves much better if they are writing something out or drawing a picture. So this is something that I often do with my community listening sessions, where instead of tell me something, draw a picture and basically describe it in that way, because not all of us are A personalities. So we're not necessarily going to engage openly, and not all of us are necessarily going to be the best way we communicate isn't necessarily through verbally. So this is the idea of this. So I've actually have this map, beautiful map. I could hang this in a museum. But this is my neighborhood. I live in a neighborhood called Mount Airy in Philadelphia. And you see my house there, and I live next to the train, near the train station. The problem with the train station, of course, is that since the pandemic, they cut back service to where it really only comes by once an hour, which pretty much makes it in many cases absolutely worthless, because especially I have two kids, it's very difficult to try and plan your life around something that only comes after an hour. There's a playground up the street. It's okay. There's a library that's right up the street. It's heavily utilized. They do a lot of events there. There's a grocery store. It is overpriced and awful, but it's there in case you need something. The fire department is nearby. There's another playground a couple of blocks away. The teenagers tend to hang out there, so I don't take my two kids that are under 6 there too often. There are churches, and then across the street is Miss Val. Miss Val is a retired school teacher who throws a block party every year, and she knows everybody, and she knows everybody's business. So you have to understand, you don't want to basically upset Miss Val, because she will gossip on the socials. But she actually is a very wonderful person who really is connected and embracing of her community. So this is sort of my map of my community. You don't have to share, but is there anything that any of you gathered? I mean, in terms of you can hold it up to the camera if you want, but you can certainly speak through it. Is there anything that you gathered through your own analysis of your particular community or your own maps? Anything you'd like to share?
Sure. I'll just share that in my neighborhood, I live in a part of West Philadelphia that is pretty close to Clark Park. It's a really gigantic green space, and it's absolutely like the hub of the neighborhood. And I think everybody feels, just pretty grateful to have a gathering space that is like free and shaded and has benches, and there's a whole artery that is Baltimore Avenue that takes you right to the park, and then there's just businesses all around the park. Like that whole stretch of Baltimore has coffee shops and barber shops and places to buy gifts. And like I just think the park remains kind of the heart of things. And it's interesting because it's not a grocery store. It's not, there's nothing you need there. Like it's just grass. But it's really like where people will go to meet each other and where events happen. It's also where you find information. There's flyers all over the park. And then there's like a yoga studio that's very near the park. That's kind of become, when the weather is bad, people hang out at the yoga studio. And it's not just that they teach yoga there, it's that they have an art gallery there. They have public performances there. They teach workshops there. So I don't know, it all kind of feels like, it's a free resource, a park, and maybe that's why it works. But you're going to find all kinds there at any time of day and night. At night, there's like an intensive chess scene. Like mostly older Black men play chess in that park every night. and families are there, morning to evening. So I don't know. It's just like drawing the map. I realized everything that I was drawing was I was drawing it in relation to the park.
Absolutely. And as I'm going to explain, there are always community centers or sort of gathering hubs or places where everybody happens to go. You can meet people, and that's where people tend to communicate. The one thing I didn't mention about the library, there's a nice little parklet there. They have benches and they actually have hammocks, and you can actually see people hanging out there. Also near the train station, one thing that I would add is everybody in the neighborhood decided to put their old children's toys by the train station. There's a little makeshift playground for toddlers. And that was something that has organically evolved over time. So that's another place, especially if you have young children, you can actually socialize and meet with people. And that's completely organic. But it's right next to the train station. Would anybody else like to add anything?
I'd love to share. This is Melina. And so I live in a college town, and there's a green at the center of town. And in nice weather, in the winter time, the college creates a skating rink for part of it. They flood a part of it and make it a skating rink. But at this time of the year, when it's actually a little bit warmer, and I'm sure at this time that you find lots of college students on the green playing frisbee. If it's nice weather, having picnics, people come with their families and their dogs. So that definitely is a meeting space. And then I thought of two others. One is a community center. It's the Black Community Center. And people go there. The kids come for, different like karate classes, dance classes. I mean, like social dancing classes, not like ballet or anything, but they have sessions for older adults, oftentimes in the morning. And then the kids programs are usually, if it's not summer, they're in the evening. They have all kinds of things going on there. And then the third place is actually the grocery store, because when you go to the grocery store, people go at a certain time, right? If they're working, they usually go at lunchtime or at the end of the day, but older adults go in the morning. And so this has happened to me. I tend to go late at night when I'm driving back from Concord, and I generally see the same cashiers because that's their the time that they work. I usually oftentimes see the same people because we're kind of on the same schedule. So even though it's not a formal thing, it's definitely, oh, you saw so and so at the co-op, and there are different branches of the co-op in different parts of the town. So it's really a meeting place.
Absolutely. And again, when we talk about gathering spaces, it's where people are gathering and where people, and often even if it's a little 30-second conversation, you're meeting with people, you're having conversations with people. And there are certain places that, for instance, during the day, it might be older residents. At night, it might be teenagers. I know that when I was a kid, I used to hang out. There's a convenience store called Sheetz in Pennsylvania. That's where I grew up. And that's where, when you were 15, you hung out at Sheetz. But that was where, if you wanted to meet with some young people, that's where you would actually go. The reason for this exercise is to, one, think about when we're talking about communities, is to really grasp, we understand that everyday lived experiences are not necessarily these events or these horrific things. It's going to the grocery store, getting gas, talking with your neighbor. That's where we really want to ground when we try to understand what's happening in a community. It's to really have an understanding, a map of what each community looks like and the types of people that live in the community, and that helps you find also the types of issues within each community. And that is the basic.
Can I make a social?
Oh, go ahead.
Go ahead. Can I make a social observation about my community more than a geographical one?
Sure, go ahead. Yes.
It'll be brief. I'm going to pretend I still live in Washington, D.C. and not Southeast Asia. So the community I live in or lived in, the person who would have been familiar with the most business owners and pedestrians and longtime residents and relatively shorter time residents, the equivalent of, to use your term, mayor, probably died about, I'm going to estimate maybe it was in the fall. So let's say going on a year and a half ago-ish, probably in his mid-80s. So since he's not like posted up anymore, and he's probably lived in that community since at least the late 50s, and his children grew up there. There's no person I could point to. There's people that have lived there a long time, not that many because of his age, but there are some. But they didn't sit outside and they didn't stand in certain places like near certain businesses or relatively close to a certain barber shop, because he knew a lot of people that would either go in there or work there, or near a couple of different stores, because he was out a lot and he walked. And it wasn't so much he was walking, but he probably hadn't moved maybe in, I'm estimating maybe like 60 or 64 years. So people recognize him even if they didn't know his first name. And sometimes people would beat their horns if they were at an intersection and light changed and it was red while they recognized him. And some of these people are like 40 years younger than he, 30 years younger, 15, 20 years younger. And so since he died, there's nobody even close to that level of like unofficial professional greeter / mayor / knows like who owns which store, who's moving out, what nationality they're from, what are they leasing or owning, all these like different like nuggets of information about the community that were stored in his, and you would never see him talking to these people. So you kind of like didn't know how he knew, but he did know. And so he was like a fixture. The other social observation I make was not so much like a directional observation, is so this neighborhood is immersed almost amid Catholic University campus, not right on it, but I mean it's surrounded by it, and other tangential institutions that are related to Catholic University, like monasteries and office buildings and houses that undergrads live in, and just other like things that are ancillary to the fact that there's a Catholic college campus there. And one thing I noticed when I was sort of sketching is that I know way fewer people than I did like in the 1970s or even maybe 80s. Because when I was like 12 to like 18, people that were born during the baby boom, a lot of them were either no less than 2 years younger than I or no less than 2 years older. Whereas now I probably know maybe a tenth of that many people in maybe a 6 or 7 block radius.
Absolutely. And
I might know like 4 people's first names now.
Mm-hmm. And
I might have known 80 people's first names in the 70s and 80s.
Absolutely. Thank you for sharing that. I do want to go on, but I'm glad you pointed it out, because the other reason that asset mapping is so important is that you get a sense of how neighborhoods are changing and how they're in flux. Because when you start to document different places, you can note that this has been here for the last 40 years. And these are the type of people who actually go to this particular place, whereas this has been here for the last 2 years, and this is the type of people who go there. So you're allowed to basically really understand the changing dynamics of communities, which particularly in urban areas are fluid as a result of things like gentrification. But basically, it's very simple how to actually go through this process. Basically, first you start with creating a spreadsheet, where you're and it can essentially be a source list and / list of places where people are gathering. And I typically will just use Google sheets, and you're listing out 4 categories. Who are those influencers? So that gentleman who passed away would certainly be an influencer. What are the key community organizations in those places? What are those gathering spaces, or what I like to call the info hubs in these spaces? And then you can't necessarily put this digitally, but what are there digital spaces where people are gathering and collecting information? And these are 2 examples of maps that I've taken from my project in Pittsburgh. And it's really simple. If you use Google Sheets, you can develop a actual map by placing the spreadsheet and its contents in My Google Maps. Not Google Maps, but it's called My Google Maps. And basically, but if you've used Google Maps, you use it the same way. You put in an address, something comes up and it allows you to actually put in some information. But if you actually have the spreadsheet set up, you can actually just drop everything in there and it will allow you to note where things are. So in this case on the left, one group actually noted all the bus stops because those can actually serve as information hubs. So again, with influencers, I urge, start with rethinking expertise. Influencers are not simply the people who are the heads of organizations. There are people who have great lived experience. For instance, this is a photo of a postal worker on a retirement after being with the Postal Service for 40 years. Somebody who's been a postal worker in a single community for 40 years probably has as great an understanding of what's happening in that community as anybody you will find. So this is somebody who I would call an influencer. And Miss Val across the street worked in the Philly school districts for more than 30 years. She's an influencer. Somebody, I'm thinking it broadly, somebody who may have been formerly incarcerated, who's back in the neighborhood. They may know a lot of different people and a lot of different people that you wouldn't necessarily connect with through the usual channels. They can be an influencer. And also volunteers. So basically the idea is somebody who has an impact in the community that is known. You want to put the people who are the heads of organizations there, but you also want to make sure you're listing other people who have different ways of influencing their community. Organizations are simple. You certainly have your national organizations like NAACP, all of those different kinds, but they're also very community-centered organizations. And this is Pittsburgh. Basically, yeah, you have your urban league, but you actually have very influential are the Black fraternities and sororities in Pittsburgh. There are different churches. There are different older organizations like BPEP, newer organizations like Urban Kind that are dealing with social issues. You can even get as granular as block organizations. There are just a whole host of different organizations. You want to make sure that you're listing those out. Then your info hubs, community centers, libraries, malls, places of worship, informal gathering spaces like the bus stop, virtual spaces, which I'll go into, but coffee shops, barbershops, salons. Why are these important? Because people are sharing information there. And depending on the community, they are especially important in the context of being able to share information. So for instance, I've done work in Central Pennsylvania. That's where I'm actually from. In Central Pennsylvania, which has an exploding Latinx population, but the newsrooms are not translating. So if you are Spanish speaker, you cannot utilize local media. So what often happens is grocery stores where you can also get your home products that are similar from your home. You also put up flyers. You go there just to talk to people who can speak Spanish because you know that they're going to be there and you're going to get information there. Those are places that can really serve as very strong information hubs. And these would need to be on the map. Digital spaces, we know them. And in many cases, people are communicating about their neighborhood on Facebook. They're using Nextdoor, if you want to tread through all of that. Different communities use things like WhatsApp, Line, Also, Slack is something that you'll also see. So we already know where these digital spaces are. You can't necessarily map them on my Google Maps, but you can put them into a spreadsheet so that you'll have an understanding of what's happening. And how do you actually go about building this asset map? Multiple ways. And it could be through just going along Google Maps and finding all the organizations, going through your old clips, but also through direct engagement practices. They'll actually also help you build your maps out. So, for example, one of the things that I encourage people to do is go out and table at events. Or, you know, that bus stop that you found out about, table there. And from there, find out some other folks that you can put on your asset map, find out about other organizations that you may not know. Have them write down the information on Post-it notes. Community walks. During Pittsburgh, we actually had folks just walk around the community, and you will see things that you never thought you saw, that you never noticed, like a drug treatment center in the corner of an alley that, oh, I never went down this way, but this is a significant thing in our community. A new grocery store opening up that's very small. If you actually get out and physically go along in your community, you can find out a lot more information about what's happening. And then, of course, community listening. If you're having community listening sessions in a community, make sure you're using that to gather information and intel about what's happening inside of a community. And then also having those follow-up conversations with your sources. One of the things that I emphasize that people should do to help them build that asset map, are there a few people that I'm not speaking with that I should connect with? Are there a few organizations? Are there places that people are gathering? And you're gathering that information and you're putting that out on the actual asset map. And there's a few projects that I've worked with, and I'm not going to touch on them just so we have time for questions. But if you go to Public Source, which is an actual hyperlocal news site that I've been working with as part of my project, they've actually built entire efforts around asset mapping and engagement that have led to actual news products. One in Wilkinsburg, which is outside of the city, they had the entire staff go out, do walks, build relationships, build out the map, and that allowed them to actually build an actual, it's called Points of Pride, and you can actually go on here, and I can click on here real quickly, and you'll actually see their actual news and information, and then they actually have their asset map built out. So they built the asset map, and then they actually built the project. And then I have another project. I'm just going to go ahead, stop there. That's focused on another community called Beachview, where they did something similar. So the idea really is that you're going out, you're building this asset map, but you're continually adding to it through your engagement practices so that it is an institution for your newsroom. Everybody's adding to it, everybody is updating it, and you are constantly making sure that you're utilizing that to help you have a better understanding of what's going on in your community. And once you really understand and you're building it and you're utilizing it, it allows you to really build very strong narratives and very strong stories that will benefit your newsroom. So that's pretty much what I had wanted to present on community asset mapping. Again, it is a tool. I would encourage all of you to try and utilize that. It does take time to build, but it really allows you to understand who you're connecting with and also who you're not connecting with. And literally, you can physically see that on the map. So one of the things that in Philadelphia that actually did work here, we mapped everything out in a neighborhood called Germantown. We saw that we were really inside of West Germantown, but we didn't have the connections in East Germantown. So from there, we actually, a project called Germantown Info Hub, which is now part of Resolve Philly, we actually had the reporters emphasize getting in and engaging in that part of the community so that we can make connections with the part of the community that wasn't getting covered. So with that, I wanted to certainly leave time for questions and any other feedback that you may have.
I had a quick question.
Yes, absolutely.
Did you find in working with different newsrooms on this that there were certain community engagement areas that were similar from one community to the next? Like, do you have like a list of more common places?
In terms of places where people are gathering,
Yes.
parks, libraries, grocery stores.
Okay.
We actually would encourage people to get table outside of the grocery store. That might be difficult depending on if it's a private business. Some places will allow you to do that, but that's where everybody's actually gathering. So those institutions where everybody typically will go, regardless of their demographics, those are probably the best places. But it also depends on the community. In some places don't necessarily have a lot of physical assets because people aren't necessarily there.
Okay.
So it may be the bus stop.
Okay.
In churches, again, they may be influential in some communities, in other communities they're not. But typically places where people gather to hang out universally, or places where they need to go, like grocery stores, they typically and of course libraries. Now libraries depends on a community. Some communities very robust use of their library services. Some communities their library is struggling to survive. But I would say typically places where people are actually going out, such as grocery stores, malls, and the park.
Okay.
I have a question.
Yes.
I know Pennsylvania is very is considered culturally and socially and ethnographically a very disparate place in terms of like the ways in which people vote and the ways in which communities are organized. Like Eastern is very different than Central and Harrisburg and the Allentowns of the world and the Eastons. Bethlehem's are very different than living in the West where the coal mines were. And just the way that the people vote and the way they eat and the way they listen to music is very sort of all over the place, almost like a Texas or Kentucky. Do you find that in the mapping and in the way that you're presenting these this guidance to people, that in places where people almost do everything in a car, it's a little trickier for them to build out these tools because they don't go many places on foot, like in states that are where everything is super spread out. Not everything, but where things tend to be super spread out, like the Arizonas and the Georgias and some parts of Texas, Southern Cal.
It's actually easier. If there are fewer things, then that community has a greater connection to the few things that they have. And actually, in those types of, I'm thinking of central Pennsylvania where I've worked, everybody goes to the same grocery market, regardless of who they are. There's only a few parks. People tend to go to those parks, regardless of who they are. Not necessarily, I mean, there's segregation patterns and things of that nature, but there's just less to actually map. So you're not necessarily getting as granular, although in many cases you can get more in depth because there is less to actually focus on, and then you're starting to even think of, well, people tend to hang out this person's place, so this is something that we should map, or this is the block party that happens. So I mean, there's certainly more
like maybe
in
where the
an
children
urban
play
area,
soccer or
but
something like that. Well, the soccer,
sorry?
Or maybe someplace in a spread out community or suburbia, like where all the youth teams play soccer the same day, like Saturday morning, all the moms and the dads are dropping the kids when they watch soccer.
Yes. But even in those small,
That's where all the talking and the, yeah.
but I would also say even in those small communities, there are places that you're probably not thinking of. So for instance, I'm just going back again, kids hanging out at the sheets. That is a big thing. That is a thing. And it's something that people may not note, or people hanging out at just to hang out at I'm thinking of my childhood, the abandoned mill where people would just gather in the evening just to hang out. These are all places where communication is actually being spread. So you have to really, and that's where driving around and really understanding what is in the community is going to be key.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Other questions? I know I presented a lot in a short period of time. In terms of the tool itself, my Google Maps, again, if you play around with it, you can figure it out pretty quickly. It's literally, if you've ever put directions in Google Maps, it's the same thing. The only difference is you're putting in pins into the community. And the spreadsheet, if you transfer it, will basically help put those pins in for you.
Letrell, do you have any advice for tracking the outcomes of your asset map? Like how to find out, oh, did you go to a new place because you saw this, or have businesses on the map seen more traffic, etc.?
So that's where having the follow-up conversations are key. I think that you don't just want to have people on the map. You want to actually have a lot of communication with them, set up regular times, check-ins, maybe once a month. So, and I would do this with any story in general. So, especially after you have a story, follow up with those folks to see, has there been more traffic? Has anything changed? I know anecdotally, for instance, I was speaking with somebody 2 days ago. One of the communities that we asset mapped in Pittsburgh, there's been more news coverage, not only by the actual organization that's done it, but it's snowballed because once one news organization focuses, oh, I guess this is the thing to cover now. So having those conversations just to see what those impacts are, that's one way. The other thing is you can actually use tools. I know that with American Press Institute, we actually have a tool called Metrics for News, which actually helps you document the types of information coming in, and also source matters, which allows you to track your sources. If you have something automated, you can actually tie your source, your actual asset map, and utilize that to, and basically try and get them to work so that you're actually documenting evidence of, you have these sources, who's being utilized, who's not being utilized, what communities are we in, so that you're actually using some sort of data to have those two tools speak with each other. Does that answer? I'm sorry.
Yeah, thanks.
No problem.
I think this is, hi Letrell, this is Melina. For some reason, I cannot get my video back. I don't know what, it's blocked for some reason, but yeah, I really like this idea of thinking about the influencers who are not the grass tops, who are in the community, who, like for instance, the postal worker, if that person is out and about in the community, or a person who's known as just someone who's always out and about and knows everyone. And so often we forget about, we forget about these individuals, or we haven't taken the time to get to know who they are, so that when we'd like to report on a community, we don't have that kind of relationship or contact to really get the full scope of what's going on. So thank you.
It's so important, because too often, if you're only talking to those grass tops leaders, this is the fact of the matter is, and this is what I found, we rely heavily on organizational leaders for comments about a community, when you start talking to actual folks on the ground, you'll find out a lot of the folks in the community don't like that organization, or they don't feel that that organization actually represents their interests. So for years, you've been going to this organization that people in the community actually hate. So that's only where, if you're talking to folks on the ground, you understand that you shouldn't be quoting this organization because they don't have the type of connection with your community that you think they have. So that's, again, really just talking with different people, you get the sense of what's actually happening within a neighborhood. And that's one of the things, probably the most interesting thing that I found with this work, is that people will tell you, community organization X, no, we don't mess with them. They lie. And you have, of course, you have to get the context, and there's different, but you find different opinions as opposed to just going to the same folks over and over again.
Yeah, I learned that the hard way when I worked for a PR firm, and one of our clients was the CDC. And for the CDC, we were tasked with going into cities in the Deep South and engaging with Black men that were particularly vulnerable to HIV/AIDS, or susceptible to it, or lived, for lack of a better term, lifestyles that made them more exposed to it. Places like Jackson or Fort Lauderdale and New Orleans. And we would have to pick, we were flying in from DC in each case. We would have to pick 2 or 3, usually 2 community-based organizations that actually engage the men, and then fly in and meet the first day with the public health officials in that city, like Jackson or Fort Lauderdale, get their opinion on what was being done, not done, what could be done better, what they were doing, how they were serving these males. And then the second day we would meet, usually like a lunch or a working lunch, with 2, not necessarily at the same time, but community-based organizations. We couldn't pick 2 that were rivals, or one was super better funded than the other one because they didn't like each other. But we would meet with the CBOs that actually touched the men. Then the third night, or the second and a half night, we would have a town hall where the actual men that were served by the CBOs and supposedly served by the Board of Health would come, and it was just an open, like, safe space, and they could voice their own feelings about, like, shortcomings and not enough pamphlets and not enough PSAs. They don't do this, they don't do that, they don't listen. And even though the CBOs had the best interests of the males at heart, I mean, on paper, the things you would hear in the town halls were like night and day from what the community-based organizations said that the men think and the men want and the men need.
Absolutely, and that's key. And that's why, again, making sure that you understand where in the community you're getting and having a diversity of voices is going to be key. Unfortunately, I have to have a hard stop. I actually have another event that I'm going to be talking about similar things. It's open. So if you wanted to hear more about this, it's actually, I dropped it in the chat, and I will be talking more about this in relation to elections. So again, thank you for your time. And if you have any questions, you can certainly find my information out. American Press Institute. I'm the only Letrell Crittenden there, and you can certainly contact me through there.
Excellent.
Thanks so
Thank you
much.
so much, Letrell. This was wonderful.
Absolutely. And
Thank
Thank you so much.
Take care.
Thanks.
Bye.